Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this conference, Is It Time for Basic Income? Hosted by Bristol Festival of Ideas and the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm a professor at the University of Bath and director of the Institute for Policy Research. And I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to this conference today. I see in my bar that we've got 455 people currently with us. So a really big welcome to you all. I'm very glad you could join us for today. We've got a fantastic array of speakers from academia, from think tanks, from the UK, from overseas, some great people to talk to you today. We're going to be addressing a wide range of questions. We want to situate the discussion of universal basic income within a wider economic, social and political context. So progressively through the day, we'll move towards issues of basic income, but we're going to start with discussions about the economic situation we face at the moment, the context we face in the current crisis. We're going to be looking at questions of social policy, social security, and of course, some of the political questions that arise with basic income and proposals for welfare state reform. So when we're thinking about these economic questions, what is the structure of the UK economy? How does it perform? How does it sit within a global context? We are coming out of not just an economic crisis triggered by the COVID pandemic, but of course, the second crisis in a little over a decade, the Great Financial Crisis in 2008. What have the impact of those twin crises been, and what do they mean for our thinking? And what are the implications for monetary and fiscal policy, which sit behind the context of much of what we're going to discuss today? And of course, changes in the labour market, not just the rise of unemployment, but the changes that we've seen in the composition, the structure of the labour market in recent decades, the growth of much more precarious, low-skilled work, the rise of automation and technological change, which for many people are potentially drivers of the need for something like a basic income, but it's a very contested thesis. We'll be looking at that today too. And questions of social change, social reform, what's driving change in our society and our relations with one another, and our social security, the evolution of our welfare state in the last decades, what the crisis has exposed in the UK and other countries about their welfare states, how well they've performed, the gaps, the holes in those welfare states, what governments have had to do in many countries to ensure that people's livelihoods don't simply get swallowed up by the crisis, that they've had to engage in rapid emergency responses. What does that tell us about the structure of our welfare state? And what should our priorities for innovation and reform be in social security in the UK and elsewhere? And then finally, on the political economy of these questions, what are the big interests at stake in our economy and our public policy? What are the kinds of electoral coalitions that might be marshaled behind forms of change, such as basic income? And how do the experiments we've seen in things like basic income in different countries, how do they relate to the political economy of those countries? And what are their prospects for success? How might they bring more people behind them in movements for change? So those are some of the questions we're going to be looking at as we try to think about basic income in this wider context. In a minute, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, a conversation I'm going to have with Gavin Kelly of the Resolution Trust. But I have a little bit of housekeeping I have to do first. So just to remind you that all of today's sessions are being recorded and replays will be available as soon as they finish. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to submit them via the Ask a Question or the chat format. All you need to do, we'll do our best to respond to those. And once each session finishes broadcasting, you'll be called through to the next session of the day. So all that will be done behind the scenes. All you need to do is sit back and enjoy it. And if you're using social media, using the hashtag for Twitter is hashtag UBI conference. So I think that's everything I need to do by way of housekeeping. And having done that, let's get proceedings underway and kick off the first session. So our first conversation this morning for the first sort of half an hour or so is with Gavin Kelly. And Gavin is the Chief Executive of the Resolution Trust. He's chair of the Resolution Foundation, one of our leading think tanks in the UK, and many of whose colleagues are speaking here today. He was previously Chief Executive of the foundation itself, and before that worked in number 10 as the Downing Street Deputy Chief of Staff. He's also the chair of the Living Wage Commission, which sets the living wage rate for the country, or the rates in London and elsewhere, and chair of the Time-Wise Innovation Unit for Flexible Work. So Gavin brings a perspective not just on policy making and on these big questions of economic social policy, but also on the labour market at the sharp end, with people in receipt of the living wage or in lower paid work. So Gavin, a big welcome to you this morning. Thank you very much for joining us for this opening session. And I suppose I want to start the conversation really by going back to something I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is that the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis that it's caused is the second global crisis we've had in a little over a decade. And these two twin crises. And so one question that this poses is, what has the impact of those crises been on the British economic model, and what have we learned in policy in how we've responded to them? What have these crises meant for how governments, particularly the UK government, has responded?
Well, thanks for that, Nick. And let me just say thanks to you and your colleagues at Bath, and to Andrew Kelly and his colleagues at the Festival of Ideas, who are friends of ours. And this looks like a fantastic event, and thanks to so many people turning out and giving up a chunk of their morning to listen to this conversation. So that is appreciated. And I'm going to look forward to listening into some of the other sessions, because they look fantastic. There's different parts to your question in it, so let me try and sort of unpack that a bit. So I've been thinking a bit about, with a shock of this epic scale, what should we expect, or what should we not necessarily expect in terms of the kind of impact it has on our existing economic and political settlement? So that's one bundle of questions, I think. And I think that's a really interesting and important discussion, because I think that there's a lot of people writing in the space at risk of getting this a bit wrong. So we can explore that. And then I think there's just another big thing about which I think directly your question, like what have we learned? What has this exposed about the nature of our economy and about the nature of our social settlement? Because it has exposed things, many of which I think are not entirely surprising to us, even if they're very ugly things that have been exposed. But probably some new things too. So should we kind of take it in that way? I suppose, like lots of people, I was sort of avidly trying to make sense of what was going on earlier in the spring and trying to think through some of the kind of implications. And there was this outpouring of kind of COVID crisis literature, if you like. And there was a kind of underlying assumption running through a lot of it, including by very eminent people that I kind of greatly enjoy reading and look up to in many ways, historians and political economists. And then there was a sort of assumption that a shock of this scale, and this is like nothing that any of us have ever lived through, to state the screaming obvious, and much bigger in many ways than 2008, which at that time felt like the biggest shock that any of us had ever lived through. A shock of this scale must, is the kind of argument that many make, lead to far-reaching political and economic transformation. And in some ways you get pushes towards some sort of new settlement in the way that we had after World War II and in the way that we had through the Thatcher era. And that kind of, I think, has become, or was potentially becoming, a kind of dominant way of thinking about this, that basically epic shock must equal a big shift in your system of politics and your system of public policy. And to put it in kind of Beveridgean terms, he spoke in 1942 when he was writing his famous report about some moments requiring a revolutionary response, which is what he saw his great report as being, and other moments being suitable for kind of patchwork response. And he was very clear that that wasn't what the country needed after World War II. And I think that kind of frame runs through our intellectual history of how we look at how we respond to shocks. And I suppose my starting point is I don't kind of just think we can say epic scale shock means we shift to a new sort of political and economic way of doing things in this country. I think the history of shared history of political economy over the last century and more is one in which the forces of continuity are very deep. In many ways, they're more powerful and harder to shift than the forces of change. And I think you have to examine this question rather than just assume any sort of automatic change. Clearly, there will be lots of ramifications of this crisis where lots of people are going to work and travel and consume differently. I'm not suggesting that there's any world in which there's not change. What I'm talking about is, do we reach some sort of new settlement in terms of our public policy kind of infrastructure, if you like. That's what I think we have to question. And I think that's just very contingent. I think it's radically contingent. And I think in the past, it's depended upon some sort of alignment between a kind of combination of a political leadership, a moment in which a political leadership has been able to make an argument for change. I think that's kind of a necessary condition. I think there is another necessary condition, which is a body of ideas, which kind of either explicitly are absorbed, if you like, by kind of governing interests, or subconsciously kind of allocanes or kind of dictate the behaviours of the madmen and authority type thing without them even realising that they've digested them. But I think there has to be a shift in the body of ideas if you want a real transformation. And usually there's kind of new interests, new demands, new class or sectional kind of cleavages open up, and they're kind of represented in new ways. And they're kind of the sorts of things you tend to see brought together if you're going to have a 1945 moment, or I think as many people are referring back to a 1932 moment in terms of kind of a Rooseveltian moment. And I'm not sure if you see, I mean, who knows? I don't know, none of us know, but I'm not sure if you see at this moment in time that alignment, if you like, of kind of leadership, political leadership, galvanising, kind of making a case for far-reaching change, as well as a pervasive new body of ideas, as well as kind of new interests being articulated. Now, I don't want to sound like this, that's a huge discussion, and I think it's a discussion we should focus on rather than just assuming that we kind of know that those things all point in one direction. So that's the conversation I think we need to have a bit more of. I think though, there's a risk that if you sort of say all that, it means like, well, what can we say? It's all too hard to say anything, and maybe nothing's going to change. And I think that's equally implausible in a way. And I think there are some arguments we can already make quite a strong case for. And I think, to pick just a few, one is, I don't see any world in which the British state is not going to grow over the next, there's nothing about our current national predicament, both in terms of the longer term pre-COVID forces at work, and then what we're living through now, which says to me smaller states. I mean, literally, there is nothing about that which says smaller state. And we can talk about the different ways in which the state may expand and the pace at which that may happen. At the moment, it's happening in a very kind of fast, accelerating way. But I think even beyond, hopefully, if we get through the worst, and who knows the different stages that we're going to go through of this kind of crisis, but even if we get to a different sort of place over the next 12, 24 months, I still think the underlying pressures, the tectonic pressures, are towards a pushback from the kind of reduction in the size of the state. So I think that's kind of there, and we can discuss that. I think it's definitely the case that when you have a shock of the scale that we've had, that you're living through a moment in time where change is more possible and there is more in flux and more is up for grabs. I think there's the historian Gershom Scholem has got a nice phrase called, refers, occasionally you get plastic hours in history. And I do think we can think of this as a plastic hour, an hour where a moment, and it is a moment, and those moments end. So that's kind of one of the key things about his idea. But a moment where change can happen, where if pressure is applied, you can change the shape of stuff, basically. But that depends, as he and others have argued, on all sorts of factors. But I think we are in one of those moments where I think you could make the case that bigger change is much more possible than it was, than it felt was possible 12, 24 months ago even. But again, that's all to play for. And I think in terms of kind of more politics and political economy, I think it is definitely the case that the terrain of politics and political economy has shifted in terms of the things we are going to be talking about. And this relates to my first point about the size of the state. I mean, in a way, the facts have shifted to the left, but that doesn't mean to say that party politics are going to shift to the left. So the facts in that, what do I mean by that? I mean, the things we are going to be talking about is kind of how much the government has to do, what sort of economic security systems need to be put in place. Why is it that the state can't act even more effectively and be more agile and be more efficient? But these are kind of conversations that people, traditionally people on the more social democratic side of the argument, if you like, should feel more like home turf. These are issues that they kind of feel like are in their DNA to a greater degree. And I think one of the great mistakes of kind of how we sometimes read politics is that sometimes when issues move towards the more comfort zone, if you like, of one party or another, it doesn't necessarily imply that party then benefits, because there are all sorts of other things come into play. And actually sometimes the electorate's quite like counterintuitively a leader from a different sort of persuasion seen to kind of move in and actually almost reluctantly move into that space and have to do the things that they don't really want to do, but they're doing it in the national interest. So I think just because the facts move to the left, I don't think we should at all read across that party politics necessarily does so. But I think it is the case that the things we're going to be talking about are the issues that people who think about the role of government in our society and our economy are going to, generally speaking, feel more comfortable on. So I think there's, these are kind of in some ways self-evidential points, but I think they are things which are kind of structure how we think about where we might be going in terms of a discussion about politics in the next few years. So that's kind of partly how I try and make sense of my thoughts about where we may be headed, if you like.
Yeah. So let's just
I'll drink my coffee.
Let's just take some elements then of continuity and change and opportunities for change. So let's go back to 2008, Great Financial Crisis. Bank of England, its original response is market hazards. We can't intervene.
I remember it well.
Let the system go down. 6 months, 12 months later, central banks of the world around the world have taken much more dramatic action. We're into a program of quantitative easing, interest rates on the floor, all the rest of it. And come this crisis, the pandemic in March, we see those central banks around the world, particularly the Fed, but not just the Fed, taking much more dramatic action, using policy tools that they had been sort of flexing, learning about, starting to use back in 2008. So in one dimension here, it looks like we've had, a massive growth in the activism and range and scope and consequences of central banks. Fiscal policy looks very different after the last crisis. We go into much more orthodox Treasury response, into austerity, cutting spending. In this crisis, big bazookas again, at least at the beginning, some very innovative things with the job retention scheme, for example. But it looks again, coming to your point about what comes next, that we're about to see fiscal policy go, when the crisis recedes, back into deficit reduction, tax increases, and so on. And there it looks like you get an innovation in the moment of the crisis, which then doesn't persist. And so thinking about this question then of the state, fiscal monetary policy, are we then looking at saying actually there's been there has just been a very big change in sort of power relations, that central banks have become more important, treasuries perhaps still more orthodox, and so when you talk about the size and the role of the state, what really are you talking about there? Is it central banks? Is it fiscal policy? Or is it that the state's going to have to be more economically active, directing change? And then we might come, for example, to the idea of a climate crisis and what that adds to this.
Well, I think, firstly, to step back, I think it is useful to hold up 2008 and 2020 together, as you've done. And I think it's worth exploring that a bit. So I think if we're having this conversation in 2030 and in 2050, I think people will bracket together. I mean, they're very different, but I think this will be seen as a passage of history which gets seen in the same sort of, the chapters will flow on from each other, and it will be a very tumultuous set of a read when you read that, the 2008 Brexit, COVID. But I think they will be seen as a kind of a passage, an era of turbulence in sort of British and beyond sort of politics and political economy. I think, I definitely think it's the case, if you like, that, how do I put it? So there's that kind of famous Milton Friedman line about, what do you do in a crisis? You pick up the ideas that are lying around, sort of thing, and you put them into practice. And actually, not that he would have been thinking of these particular ideas, but in 2020, the ideas that were lying around, if you were working in, Her Majesty's Treasury, a lot of those ideas were the ideas which were road tested in 2008, and indeed, if you're in the Bank of England too, and indeed many of them, and this does matter, as you know, a lot of the personnel at the very top of the Treasury were the people who were doing the kind of real hand-to-hand fighting, if you like, on the economic policy making in 2008. They lived through that. Most of the main people are the same. So they didn't have to read about it, they did it. And it's now in their DNA. And that really matters in terms of understanding. So I think there is a high degree of continuity, and you can sort of see that in the sense of course, like the Bank of England. So, in 2020, we didn't have to sit through, lectures from the bank governor about moral hazards before we got to the right place. as we did in 2008, because that world had changed. And, and in that sense, the climate of ideas has moved on, and the kind of what was called unconventional monetary policy is now not so unconventional, and those debates have moved on, and now we're in different sort of debates about what banks can do at zero, basically. We should maybe come on to that, what central banks can do in that sort of world. But the big shift has happened, and there wasn't any of that kind of delay and prevarication that we felt at the beginning of 2008 at all from the Bank of England. I think it's also the case if you just look at the kind of more conventional Treasury response, whether it's like, forbearance for mortgage holders, whether it's kind of job guarantees for young people. I mean, you see the DNA of a lot of that policy back in 2008. And indeed, some of the things which have worked best, and we might come on to the many, many things which have worked badly in terms of the British state's response, but some of the things which have worked best are indeed the things which had a precursor in the previous crisis. And I'm not suggesting that's because the government 2008 was, I'm not kind of imbuing that government with lots of sort of happened to work for it. But I don't think that's just because they were, more far-sighted than anyone else. I think it's also just because these things were tried and tested and so on. There was more experience of them. We were more match fit on that stuff, if you like, to some degree. So I think that is an interesting read across. But I also think all of that adds up to a risk that it leads us to think about the economic consequences of this crash as being in some way analogous to what we lived through last time. And it's just likely, very overwhelmingly likely to be, I'm already seeing this, to be honest, to be very, very different to last time. So what do I mean by that? So, obviously it was the financial sector, which took a big hit in 2008. And indeed, one of the reasons why we saw kind of inequality not do some of the income inequality, I should say, rather than wealth, not do some of the things that many people feared after 2008 is because, the finance sector took a big hit and many high salaries took a significant hit. Not necessarily the people you read about in The Guardian at the very, very, very top, but actually people pretty far up did see very significant falls. And the biggest labour-absorbing sectors didn't take so much of a hit after 2008. The pound took an absolute pounding, and that had a big consequence, but it kind of protected profit margins. It made it easier for many firms to keep people on. And what took the strain was wages. And we've lived through this unbelievable era of wage falls and wage constraints. And that's had a massive downside and all sorts of political implications and ramifications. But it meant that the pain was shared out very widely across a broad swathe of the working population, not the retired population, but the working population, and that gave you a particular political feel to that crisis. This is I think is very likely to be different. I think 2008, the rise in unemployment, which was much smaller, if you like, than the fall in GDP. I don't think there's any real reason. Paul Gregg from your university has kind of made this point very well. I don't see any real reason to expect that to be the case this time. We may well be in much more of a 1980s, 1990s type recession, where if you like, the employment rate falls by is commensurate roughly with the fall in GDP. Now that's not where we are sat here this morning, because we've had furlough and the government's done some extraordinary things to try and prevent the mass movement out of work. But those things are, as you and everyone watching knows, those things are to a large degree being faded out. And we've kind of masked the true shock, successfully, if you like, but it's going to be coming through this winter. And I really do fear the worst for what that might mean in terms of the hit to employment. So, and I think that hit will be felt in low-paying sectors, disproportionately made up of young people, much more feminized than the sectors that got hit in 2008. So the kind of fallout of this recession, I think, will feel very different to the last one. And that's still to play for to some degree. And, organizations like mine are kind of trying to shape that. So I don't want to be fatalistic, but, we've got 3 million people, roughly speaking, at the end of September still on furlough. And most, despite the fact that there's some local furlough schemes going to be reintroduced, if you like, that will be very much the exception, not the norm. And those people are going to go somewhere, and an awful lot of those people are unlikely to get back to their old job.
So, I mean, if employment was one of the silver linings of the last crisis, that the big rise in unemployment that people anticipated didn't happen, all the downsides of productivity stagnation, of austerity visited on the public services, cuts in the public services and the welfare state, all of those things were happening, which were in part, as you say, offset by the fact that employment performed much better. If in this crisis we're coming after 10 years of cuts to the public sector, and we've had 10 years of productivity stagnation, effectively, and we've got now an employment crisis to deal with. And of course, we could add Brexit to that, and we could add the climate crisis. This is a very profound. It is a very profound.
So we go into. I mean, look, the way we've got the inequality of the 1980s, which basically we're still carrying, if you like, in our society, and then we've got the stagnation and austerity of the 2010s. That's how I that's the legacy, the endowment, if you like, as well as to balance it out, as well as the high. We started off with an unprecedentedly high employment rate. But they were the kind of some of the backdrops, if you like, the social and economic forces with which we went into this, as well as the Brexit decision. And we start off in a weak place. I mean, we are exposed. A decade of austerity has exposed our state and our public services very, very severely, and we're seeing that in a multitude of ways being played out in terms of how this crisis is playing out. And we should probably come back to that because it does. Some of the things that we've learnt about our country do relate to that decade. So I think we are starting off in a very exposed way, and I do think that it's just very, very hard not to see, and we can argue about how high it will go, and no one knows for sure, but we're going to see unemployment rise a lot, and I fear it's going to be very disproportionately high amongst young people. And we know what that means for their futures and how long the scarring effect can be. And we're going to have to deal with that at a time when the kind of public services are not in great shape to be handling that. Now, the state can, I'm not a fatalist at all. And in some ways, some of our state services have shown themselves to be very resilient. But I do think we have to be clear-eyed about the exposed position that we start this crisis in.
So let's move then to some discussion about the welfare state. Let's take that one dimension of that. Obviously the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, the grants for people in self-employment. These were innovative crisis measures, but they weren't necessary in part, not just to keep people in work, but the fact that the welfare state, if people were forced to fall back on it, they would fall back to a parsimonious welfare state with lots of holes in it, with levels of income support which are flat rate rather than earnings related, where vast swathes of people would suddenly find that their household incomes would drop quite dramatically. And of course, this is one of the reasons why people advocate for a universal basic income, that they want some kind of automatic provision for everybody by virtue of their citizenship. That means that in a crisis, you're not trying to patch and mend. But what is the sort of state of British welfare and social security, given the pressures it's going to face and indeed has had to face in recent months that these innovations have been necessary? What can we expect in the 2020s, and what should be our priorities for reform?
Yeah, well, that really is a huge question. I think so. Let me start with some of what's been revealed about the state of our social security system. And as you say, part of this, you have to be kind of careful how you allocate this. Part of this, we're basically a kind of Anglo-liberal welfare state system of our own particular kind of British variety. So we don't have continental earnings-related benefits by and large, very small exceptions to that. And that's a kind of long-term feature of our system that has evolved out of both political parties. We then grew, if you like, aspects of that social security welfare system significantly through the late 90s, through the likes of tax credits and so on, which kind of gave us a different shape to many other different countries, because we had, it wasn't generous, but it was a very significant working age, new kind of tier of support, if you like, which affected most families with children. The clear majority of families with children were getting support in a way, and that was quite different to many other countries where that was much more targeted. So it was an interesting evolution of our welfare system. At the same time, as we started at the end of that period and then through the coalition years to move towards what is effectively a more of a kind of mini universal basic income for pensioners in terms of the kind of the new state pension. So that's the kind of where we were. Austerity then really just did great damage to that patchy, but with some places relatively decent, some places still very parsimonious working age welfare system. Austerity came along and obviously massively focused the pain, if you like, on that working age element. And it means that, I suppose the way I think about it is that, so we've had, Britain has had long-term chronic problems in social security, and they've become acute problems. So we've had chronic problems in the sense that, we're very, as I say, we expect people to live on very, very little, particularly single people, and we've never really dealt, the Labour government didn't really deal with that particular issue, and no one else has. We've never had a proper system of sick pay in this country. We've kind of limped along without it and basically just sort of expected, that's not been something that we've focused on, and we're paying a heavy price for that, I think, now. We've had terrible housing over it, particularly in the private rented sector, in terms of standards, in terms of congestion. And that's something which basically has not been a focus of policymakers. I think that's probably relevant to some of what we're seeing now, actually. So I think there are these issues in our social policy which have been very, probably felt acute to the people kind of living through those problems directly, but to the rest of society, it's just something that we've kind of lived with. It's held us back, in my view, as a country and as a society, but we've kind of got used to living with it. It's just part of kind of our system. In the current context, those failings, those problems are on all of us. They affect all of our chances. I'm not saying the risks are distributed evenly, but they put us all at risk. The failure of this country to have a system of sick pay, which is anything other than risible and provides no social insurance, no real collective risk pooling, and doesn't make it affordable for someone who feels ill to be off work, is on all of us now, and we're all paying the price for that. So I think it is, and that's why I think, to go back to what I was saying earlier, that's one of the reasons why I think this is genuinely kind of like a plastic hour. There are arguments you can make to a majoritarian type that it was much harder in the British tradition to make before. I'm not saying it shouldn't have been done. I'm not forgiving anyone, but I think it was much harder. That just wasn't part of kind of where some of our politics was. And I think now we have a moment of possibility. And frankly, if you are on the side of the argument which cares about these things, and you can't make a case in 2020 for, say, a different system of how we think about, a completely different system for how we think about protecting people who are ill, who are in work, then you should be doing something else. I mean, this is just like, what are you here for? This is the moment to be making some of these arguments. I'm focusing on sick pay, but I could talk about other things too. But it's just such a vivid example that has been so overlooked. It isn't even, it's interesting because if you look back at this country, we introduced things like maternity pay as part of our kind of new social, it took us a while, but we got there, and we got there under a Conservative government and then transformed it under the Labour government. And that actually does have an earnings related, we decided to actually sort of break with the mold, if you like, and put in to some degree of earnings related system to that. I'm not saying it was generous enough, but that was a departure, and we've just not done that for many other things. And so I think we're going to pay the price for that. Now, I think we have to, where that takes us to, and is it possible to make a bigger case, a kind of pro-security majoritarian case for thinking about working age social security different? I think the jury's really out on that, but whether that's going to be winnable. But I mean, my God, this should be the moment to be pushing that, because never has the kind of the health, well-being, and economic security of the majority relied on our capacity to look after people who are in a weakened state so much as it does now. And so I really do think that is vital. And that is something which, even though we're in the height of, we're in the kind of the middle of this storm right now, and we're kind of managing it, and we shouldn't be, this isn't a big moment for lots of policy discussions. In some, I can see that, if you're in the, I don't know, if you're trying to kind of make your way, you want to be setting out lots of detailed policy. But I think the argument now needs to be made about some of the need for these changes, even if we're designing the policies a bit later.
So let's just let's go into the politics of that a little bit. We've talked about that earlier. Resolution Foundation does lots of work on intergenerational questions, on intergenerational policy, but also some of the kind of politics of intergenerational questions. one of the priorities in the early mid-90s was the so-called sort of social investment state.
Yeah.
Right, to move towards investing in skills and childcare and welfare to work strategies and so on. Much of that kind of investment depends on resources going to younger people and people of working age.
Yeah.
And yet, when you look at the sort of political support for the welfare state or changes in it, you have this very dominant block of older voters. Older voters who've delivered Conservative majorities, who were essentially the kind of bedrock of the Brexit vote. And as you said, who saw their benefits largely protected in the era of austerity, the basic state pension rising by the triple lock, and so on. So it may well be that age isn't the new class, that there are class dimensions to this question of age.
Sure.
But certainly it looks increasingly improbable or implausible in the UK that you can make the kinds of advances that you're seeking, whether it's reforms to the existing welfare state, the creation of new institutions, or things like basic income, without having some intergenerational compact politically with those older voters and their children and grandchildren. That we need, in a way that in the past perhaps we had kind of cross-class politics, that we need something which addresses these intergenerational divides. Is that something that you think? I mean, is that true? And if it is, what does it mean? What does it mean for?
Well, I think it is true in the sense of, if we're going to get a kind of period of stable governance at some point with a kind of majoritarian outlook on how to govern in the interest of the whole country, then that is going to have to be powered by a government which has clearly got a kind of pan-generational kind of worldview, and is actually, and I think some other countries around the world have done a better job at this, trying to articulate the shared interests of different generations, and indeed where one generation is going to make a sacrifice in the interest of the other, why that is the case. And that isn't where we are today in this country. That's not defined. That kind of approach has not defined public policy here for a while. So, but hence, I think there is some case for gloom. But it's interesting how the crisis, we're still living through this, but how this crisis has played out. I mean, there's been first of all, we all live in families, and there's just been I think there has been a strong degree of cross-generational solidarity about concern, not just for the elderly, but also I think many old people feel incredibly anxious about the position of young people and their economic futures, and that I hear that all the time. Trading anecdote, but I hear that all the time, and I think these issues have got a greater visibility because the differentiated generational experience of this crisis is such a defining feature of it. It is in a way the most visible thing, and that is hurting different age groups in very different ways. So it's kind of outed that, and I think people, it is the case that young people care greatly about the risk to older people and so on, by and large. So I think that is interesting. I think the other thing that's interesting, in terms of, which gives me I don't know if this is a cause for hope, but it's kind of struck me, is at the start of the crisis, I read a few people saying this will be really fascinating because in this crisis, the Labour Party will have to represent the interests of young people, given its electoral coalition, and the Conservatives will unambiguously have to be the voice of older people, if you like. And that will mean, and a few people are arguing, that will mean that Labour will have to be on the side of the economic interests of young people, which will mean they'll be more sceptical about lockdowns and whatever. That will be their guiding route. And the Conservatives are going to have to be the people who sort of are defending the health and security, if you like, of older groups. And it hasn't played out like that at all. And actually, I did think at the time, I was thinking, well, really? Because, the kind of instinctive business case, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, that the Conservative Party might feel in terms of protecting kind of the viability of businesses will be very strong, and that might mitigate just sort of a kind of, we have to be on the side of lockdowns. And equally with the Labour Party, it's massive kind of historic interest in sort of the NHS and protecting the public sector and so on, it will kind of cut against it, just speaking up for kind of keeping things open to keep young people in work. And actually, so the parties haven't channeled a kind of a crass, just speaking to one sort of, one generation's interest, I don't think, through this. It's been a bit more complicated than that in different ways. So I think in some ways, maybe this has kind of reminded us that political parties are complicated beasts, so they don't just speak for one. They never really speak that nakedly for one generation, despite the fact that pensions benefits have been protected over the last 10 years. I think, but really to go back to my last point, if we are going to have a different sort of a more inclusive, less parsimonious welfare state coming out of this, never mind getting to something like a UBI, we're going to have to pay a lot more tax, and that's going to affect most of us. And that's going to affect working age people too. But I think there's no world in which you're going to get to that sort of welfare state that I would like to see, which doesn't include doing some more than we've ever done on wealth. And that's really hard, and we've never done it properly in this country. And I don't want to suggest it's straightforward, but I think it is I think it's incredibly difficult to be making a case for significantly more taxes on working age people if you're not going to go there. I think that's kind of, symbolically, never mind the fiscal arithmetic. So I think that is a part of our politics we need to get to, and whether this crisis precipitates that, I just don't know. And I'd be foolhardy if I said I think that's going to, this will open the door to it, because I think the interests which are against that are very significant.
I mean, just I suppose a final question on that point is, we had Stephanie Kelton opening this conference last night. Modern monetary theory saying, you don't have to worry about deficits in the way that you think you do. And by implication, you don't raise taxes because you need to fund your spending. Now, you can disagree or not with those questions, and we'll debate them today, I'm sure. But have the sort of politics of fiscal policy changed? Has the sort of, what we have thought for the last sort of 30 years, that Labour has a weakness on fiscal policy, always has to protect its flank against the attack that it can't be trusted with people's money and will put your taxes up, versus the Conservative Party being fiscally conservative, the party of reducing deficits and so on. Has that all changed in this crisis?
I think it has changed. I don't think it's changed completely. I think it's changed significantly. This government, a Conservative government, is going to be presiding over 100% debt to GDP and more, I would have thought, for the whole of its administration, and quite possibly the government after, whoever that is going to be doing that. That too. We are going to be. We're in a different place in terms of debt, and that's absolutely right. That we should be in a different place. And I think we've got to be really careful on this concept. I think in the end we do need higher taxes in this country, because I think in the end you probably have to pay. You have to get to some sort of, in terms of current spending, you need to be roughly paying for that via tax. So I'll probably take a different view to Stephanie Kelton on that. But that's nothing to do with paying for today's measures, right? What we're doing today is going to be handled in terms of debt for generations to come, as it would be in a war, and that's right and proper. It leaves us slightly more exposed than we would have been if this hadn't happened, but that's life, right? This is the best this is the best choice we can make. So we will have so in terms of the politics, if you like, fiscal politics, a Conservative government will be presiding over debt to GDP of very high levels. We're going to have large deficits for the foreseeable future. The kind of scarring and impact of what's happening to the economy on our tax receipts will be significant, and the pressures on public spending are going to remain high for the foreseeable. So of course there'll be speeches talking about a low tax future. That's what happens in politics, right? But the reality is that it will feel very different. And I think that in some ways is a challenge to both parties, actually, both main parties, because it'll be a challenge to Conservatives because they'll be in an uncomfortable place with very high level and rising levels of debt. But neither party will be actually the cliche that it's kind of that the other party wishes it to be, if you like, because the Labour Party would want to sort of say, well, they're totally focused on the deficit, and the government, this current government, won't be totally focused on the deficit. It just won't be. But whatever it is, this is not a possibility of that. That doesn't mean to say you won't hear things about, well, we'll be more serious about the deficit than the other lot, because that's party politics. But in terms of governing, we're in a totally different world. So I think we have changed significantly. But when it comes to the next election, some of the old tunes about different parties will resonate with some of the electorate and therefore still be played. I would have thought that probably is the case, but it'll be much harder to make, is this going to be like a 2010, 2015 election in 2024 when deficit politics sort of overshadowed all that? Absolutely. I mean, I think we can be pretty confident that isn't the case.
Yeah. I want to ask you just one sort of final clutch of things, Gavin, which is about the sort of nature of the political. So we've talked a lot about, Westminster government, UK government, the mainstream parties. But of course, it's a multinational state. The crisis has exposed that, very obviously, with different strategies being pursued in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. But it's also a state in which we've seen, lots of tensions between local leaders, mayors, and central government. And sort of more positively, advocates of welfare reform and indeed advocates of basic income have looked towards local experimentation to say, well, okay, in this very centralised British state, we have to find avenues for change at the national level, whether it's Scotland with trials for basic income, for example, or local government or mayors. I suppose just one. So there are huge questions about the future of the union. I understand that. I'm not expecting you to address those today. But this question of the question of the balance between where we look for change at the national level and how much we want to put into experimentation, how much we want to put into grassroots action, how much we want to put into what local city leaders and others can do. And that's obviously something you're involved a lot with. Resolution with some of the work you do on the labour market, on tech, and so on. I want just a bit of a sense of that from you about the British state and where policy innovation can take place.
Well, I mean, the first big picture thing is there's been a massive COVID test for the British state, and we haven't got to the end of the exam yet. But we're well into it, and it's not been pretty. But the marks are not good. Now, and there's some exceptions to that. I think the furlough scheme was exceptional. It was done in real time. Any government at any point in our history, that would be a big achievement. And I really feel that. It really was a great piece of policy work delivered in pretty much real time. So I'm not. But I think you just step back and look at Britain's performance or UK's performance, both on the health grounds and on economic grounds compared to OECD, and it's brutal. It's absolutely brutal, and it's for all manner of reason. But I think, as we have lived through this, it has become ever more clear that the UK central state's failure in its kind of working both across central agencies and in particular working with local authorities and city leaders and local authority leaders and across the nations of the United Kingdom has been deeply problematic and really exposing. I think in a way the old British state, as in the central institutions of the Treasury, the Bank of England, and indeed the Army, who show that they can build hospitals overnight, sort of thing, in the middle of in difficult situations. Those institutions doing their emergency type work did perform relatively strongly, but the modern state and its capacity to get stuff done, working across agencies and across levels, has failed. And it's failed noticeably compared to other countries. Whether those other countries have federal systems or, and not all countries have performed well, but I think the one thing you can't argue is that we perform well because we haven't on any of those grounds. So that's the backdrop in a way to answer your question. I think we have, generally speaking, suffered in this country from a lack of policy experimentation. I'm deeply in favour of that. I'm something of a UBI sceptic, but as a UBI sceptic, I would be very, very in favour of a UBI pilot at a city, at a local or city level. I think that would be a very, very progressive thing to do. So we need much more of that. And I do think one of the things, Scotland and Wales is a slightly different issue, but even within England, I think one of the things, and we've seen this over the last 48 hours, and I feel like it will stick, is that when we get to whatever the other side of this looks like, it's hard to believe that the position of city and local leaders as kind of representatives and sort of, spokespeople and kind of slightly deeper, sort of, really standing up for and channeling the interests of that place against a slightly detached feeling central government, which didn't seem to get some of what their needs. It's hard to think that's not going to be strengthened by this experience. And I feel like we've seen that quite vividly from, Manchester and Liverpool very recently. So now what that means in terms of what powers fall to those people and so on, it will be contested politics. But I think the case for it and the kind of public purchase that has amongst the citizens of cities and regions, I imagine will be strengthened when we get to the end of this, rather than weakened. And I think the position of of Scotland with having its own government it's just sort of, before this happened, it was already very well established, and we were never going to turn back. And the only question was whether there'd be independence or not. But it's now so cemented that there is, the primary agency of managing this whole situation in a country called Scotland is not the UK government, it is the Scottish government, despite the fact that the UK government is still doing very important things and pooling risks up across the whole of the United Kingdom. So I think it will have led to a kind of cementing, if you like, of the importance of sub-national or sub-UK, if you like, political leadership. And I hope that leads to the greater possibility of more powers, which in turn would lead to more experimentation, which I think would only be a good thing for a country which has had chronically little of it.
Great. Well, Gavin, thank you very much indeed. We've sort of come to the end of the time.
We've used our time
for this session, but in fact, that's a fantastic kind of panoramic overview of the situation we find ourselves in, and some heavy doses of realism and some historical lessons about continuity, but also some optimism for the contingency that opens up the possibility of change, and for some of the ways in which that might happen. So thank you very much, Gavin. It's been great to be able to talk to you this morning.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll be watching some of the rest of it.
Thanks for thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you everyone for sharing your time.
Yeah, thanks to everybody for tuning in to listen to Gavin. I think it's a really great way to start the day. Now, in the course of the conference today, we've got some pre-recorded sections from people that have been doing basic income experiments or starting them up or evaluating them. And what we're going to go to now are some comments, an interview with Libby Schaff, Mayor of Oakland, who's going to be talking about the economic and social pressures facing the people of Oakland, the idea of a guaranteed income or basic income and what it would mean. So we're going to go over to that now. Then we're going to take a break at around 10:35 until 10 to 11. We're going to come back at 10 to 11 for our first panel, which will be chaired by Martin Sambu from the Financial Times. And it'll have James Smith from the Resolution Foundation, from Gavin's organisation, Jeff Crocker, Basic Income Forum, author of an important new book on basic income and sovereign money, Francis Coppola, a renowned economist, and Joe Mitchell, another economist, a very good economist from the University of West of England. So that's our first panel. That'll be at about 10 to 11, so come back in after your break for that. But now I'm going to ask our conference organisers to move us to Libby Schaff, the Mayor of Oakland. Thanks very much. I hope we're going over. I'm going to keep talking until we do, on the basis that it's about to come. We have a poll, by the way. Is it time for basic income? Yes or no? Go into that if you are just waiting for things to proceed. Have a vote in that poll, and then come back at the end of the day, and we'll see whether people's minds have changed on the issue. And we've got some questions. I'm sure we'll try and come back to those too throughout the rest of the day. Many thanks from people to Gavin for his really great comments there.